Greetings everyone and welcome to week 7. This week we're picking up on state building projects where Cosimo left off. Now Cosimo could hardly have set up a better inheritance for his many children. The state that he built and ruled for over 40 years had a smooth functioning bureaucracy, an obedient nobility dependent upon the crown. The Grand Ducal coffers were full to the brim. He's managed his finances exceedingly well, and the state was also possessed of a new naval force, the Knights of St. Stephen, who defended Tuscany's coastlines and whose galley ships had helped crush the Ottoman navy in the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. So Cosimo had handed over effective power of the state to his eldest son Francesco I in 1564 in order to ensure a smooth transition of Grand Ducal authority. Florence, at this moment, is the capital city of the newly united Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Francesco's challenge was to keep together the dominion created by his father, and really, had it not been for his untimely death, he may very well have failed in doing that. You see, Francesco was not the man his father was. He was thin, dark-complexioned, and melancholy. He was also very self-centered. He was largely uninterested in business of ruling a state, and almost entirely given over to private pursuits. These included mostly chasing women and conducting arcane scientific experiments in his private laboratory. His wife, the Archduchess Joanna of Austria, died in 1578, leaving him free to spend the rest of his short life with his mistress, Bianca Capello, a Venetian noblewoman who was thoroughly disliked by the local Florentines. Francesco didn't do much in the way of state building. He sort of maintains the status quo, if you will. His major accomplishment politically is really to keep Tuscany mostly out of the complications of foreign wars. Another primary contribution, if you will, to the development of Florence and Tuscany, in which he was influential, was his patronage of the arts and sciences, in particular in the creation of the Accademia della Crusca, founded in 1583, which was put together to systematize the Tuscan vernacular language. So Crusca means bran or grain in Italian, and the official symbol of the academy, was a sifter, because that's essentially what the learned members of the academy did. They sifted the chaff from the wheat of the Tuscan language. So this was an assembly of the most illustrious and talented literary men in Florence, or at least those who considered themselves among the most ebullient literati, and they gathered together to dispute etymology, but also to contemplate the great works of Florentine literature, such as Dante's Divine Comedy, Boccaccio's Decameron, Guicciardini's History of Italy, and other masterpieces. So these debates between these learned men contributed to the greater understanding of medieval Tuscan as a language, as a codified language, and the greater publicization of Tuscan works of literature as a vaunted, sort of glorified canon. In 1612, the Academy published its Vocabolario della Lingua Italiana, which is a compendium of, and dictionary really, of the Italian, or more accurately, streamlined and regularized Tuscan language. As I mentioned last week, this is part of a larger trend of language homogenization across Europe in the early modern period. Now, state bureaucracies only run smoothly, obviously, if everyone is using and writing in the same language. In the case of Tuscany, the local vernacular, Tuscan itself, could vary widely, and accents could be very diverse. To this day, a Florentine has a different accent than a Sienese or someone from Pisa. But the efforts to systematize the Tuscan language, as well as the publicization and study of the vernacular works of Dante Boccaccio and other leading Tuscan authors, meant that Tuscan itself eventually developed into the official version of Italian that we speak today. After the political unification of Italy in the 1860s, it became the official state language of the unified peninsula. So even today, however, if you go to Sicily, or for example Venice, you'll find that local dialects still continue to be used by the inhabitants. So if you were to go over to a Venetian, someone who lived there, and ask them a question, they would respond to you in Italian if you were speaking Italian, but they would probably speak Venetian with their friends. Again, the founding of the Accademia della Crusca is part of a larger Europe-wide trend of sovereigns, of rulers, founding and supporting clubs of distinguished scholars. To be certain, patronage of outstanding artists and philosophers had a long history in Tuscany. Indeed, as we have seen, it was this deep tradition of patronage that accounted for the efflorescence of learning and artistic production that took place in the 15th century under Cosimo il Vecchio and Lorenzo the Magnificent. But what was happening at this point in the 16th century in Tuscany and elsewhere in Europe is a bit different. So these clubs are akin to something like debate societies, a place where new noble elites could present their ideas and formulate new theories or debate old theories on anything from alchemy to architecture. You'll read more about this academic environment in the Cochrane chapters this week, but suffice to say, it was this kind of intellectual climate that would eventually provide a sort of seedbed for the scientific ideas of the 17th century and would contribute to the open-mindedness of the Medici rulers, such that they would eventually become the protectors of Galileo Galilei when the Inquisition condemned him for his scientific theories about the Earth rotating around the Sun, rather than vice versa. So scholars, however, have condemned this period still as sort of the beginning of the forgotten centuries. They've had little to say about this period of Tuscan history and about Francesco in particular. And Francesco, he tends to get a bad rap. It's true he's not the most effective leader of a nation in the traditional sense. It's also because his father was so illustrious and such an outstanding Medici ruler. But it's also because he's not the most charming of characters. He's sort of a shut-in. He spends most of his time in his laboratory, where he studies the cutting of gemstones, and he tries out various alchemical experiments. But I would argue that it's this very inquisitiveness about the physical world around him and his patronage of other philosophers and early scientists who shared his interests that creates a climate hospitable to the scientific revolution in Florence. He and later his brother also took a great interest in the production of pietre dure pieces. These are magnificent works of art fashioned from semi-precious stones. This was an industry that flourished in Tuscany partly out of the patronage of the Medici, and Florence became famous across Europe for the quality of its pietre dure artisans. Francesco himself invented a new method of making porcelain, which was so fine and delicate that Tuscan pottery became a competitor with the exquisite Asian plates and vases that were then becoming so popular in the European market. So, while externally Francesco seemed a rather dithering duke, internally within the confines of Florence, he worked on other projects that contributed, however marginally, to the development of art and industry in Florence. His main interests, again, however, did not extend to the sort of daily business of governing. So, under his rule, Tuscany's economy and agriculture was poorly administrated. A poor coordination of local markets meant that storehouses were susceptible to the boom and bust agricultural cycles that were brought on by tempestuous weather. The last decades of the 16th century saw many floods and plagues, and in general, it was not a delightful time to be a commoner in Tuscany. At the same time, Florence's traditionally strongest industry, wool and textile production, was declining. You see, they simply couldn't compete with wool production in England and the cloth output from the Netherlands, and it was these northerners who, at the end of the 16th century, were now flooding into the Mediterranean to conduct trade. Their ships, as I mentioned back in the first lecture, were more seaworthy, able to navigate the rough Mediterranean waters of the Atlantic, as well as the more placid Mediterranean. And they were more defensible. They had more cannonry than the Italian galley ships. It was this northern invasion, as it has come to be called, that scholars have seen as responsible for the decline of what's been called the Ancien Régime, or like the old regime, the old school powers in the Mediterranean, such as Genoa and Venice, who couldn't keep up with the naval technology. Now, this reading has since been somewhat revised, but for our purposes, it's important to keep in mind that during this period, there were many new foreigners in the Mediterranean itching to do business in the silk and spice trades in the Ottoman lands, so all the way over in Anatolia, present-day Turkey, and Italy becomes a crucial stopping point along the way. Now, Francesco may not have been aware, or maybe he was uninterested in these developments, but his brother was not. Francesco died in 1587 without a legitimate heir. For centuries now, it's been rumored that he and his wife, Bianca Capello, died of arsenic poisoning, but recent tests done on hair and bone samples taken from Francesco's grave argue otherwise. It seems that both he and Bianca Capello, who was his mistress, who he had later married, died of malaria, which was then a fairly common disease in Tuscany, particularly along the marshy seaside. So, this puts Ferdinando, brother of Francesco, in power in 1587, and he is quite a bit more keen to rule actively as a Grand Duke and to take advantage of new commercial trends in the Mediterranean and Europe.